Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. Let's start with a simple fact, one you learned in school. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. It's a clean, simple story, but it's a lie. It's a fairy tale written by the winners, a footnote that erased an entire epic because half a millennium before Columbus's ships ever touched the warm Caribbean. A different kind of ship, with a dragon's head carved into it. Its crew wasn't seeking gold or spices for a Spanish queen. They were Vikings, and they weren't discovering a new world. They were just looking for a place to call home. This isn't just a story about who got there first. This is a story about a forgotten kingdom. A ghost on the edge of the map, and a saga of blood and ice that history tried to bury. This is the story of Vinland, the true story of the European discovery of America. We have to start with the man who made it possible. A man whose rage and ambition were as vast as the cold sea itself. His name was Erik Thorvaldsson, but history would remember him by a different name. Erik the Red. He wasn't born a king or a hero. He was born an exile. His father had been banished from Norway for manslaughter, and the family fled to the harsh, unforgiving landscapes of Iceland. He was a man with a short temper and a long memory in Iceland. He quarreled with his neighbors. The quarrels turned to fights. The fights turned to killings, and just like his father, Erik was declared an outlaw, banished, cast out. For a lesser man, this would be the end. For Erik the Red, it was the beginning. He had heard whispers, old sailors' tales of a vast, empty land to the west, a land of ice and rock. A place no sane man would go, but Erik wasn't a sane man. He was a desperate one. With a handful of followers, he sailed west, not into the known world, but into the blank spaces on the map. For 3 years. He was a ghost. Then he returned. He hadn't found a wasteland. He had found something he could sell. He called it Greenland. He painted a picture of lush pastures and endless opportunity, luring hundreds of Icelandic families to follow him into the unknown. He had turned his exile into an empire. He wasn't just Erik the Outlaw anymore. He was the founder of a new nation, the Lord of Greenland, and he had a son who grew up in his father's giant, bloody shadow, a son named Leif. Leif Erikson was where Erik the Red was a storm of pagan fury and raw ambition. Leif was something different. He was thoughtful, level-headed, and curious. He watched his father build a new world on the edge of the old one, but he saw its limits. Greenland was a tough, brutal place. The winters were long, the resources scarce. Its lifeline was the sea. It was during a voyage back to the motherland, to the court of King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, that Leif's destiny would be forged. King Olaf was a new kind of Viking king. He was a Christian, and he was on a mission to convert all of Norway by persuasion or by the sword. Leif, the son of a staunch pagan chieftain, met this king, and something shifted within him. He was baptized, converting to Christianity, a decision that would create a chasm between him and his father. But that wasn't the only seed planted on that journey in the halls of Norway, or perhaps on the windswept docks of Iceland. Leif heard a story, a ghost story. It was told by a merchant named Bjarni Herge Philipsson. Years earlier, Bjarni had been sailing from Iceland to join a monster of fog and wind that threw his ship wildly off course for days. When the fog finally lifted, the land he saw was not the familiar icy coast of Greenland. It was something else. A land covered in low hills and dense forests. A land he had never seen before, terrified and lost. He didn't dare go ashore. He was a trader, not an explorer. He told his story, the tale of a mysterious green coastline to the west, but he was mocked. He was called a man of no ambition, a coward for not setting foot on this new land, but the story lingered, a whisper of another world just beyond the horizon. Leif Erikson heard this whisper, and it grew into a roar in his mind. He returned to Greenland a changed man, a Christian with a mission from the King of Norway to bring the new faith to his people, and a man haunted by Bjarni's ghost story. When he arrived, the confrontation with his father was inevitable. Erik the Red, the old pagan, the self-made lord, looked at his son and saw a betrayal. This new god was a god of weakness, of forgiveness. Erik's gods were Odin and Thor. Leif preached his new faith, but his mind was on something else, that forested coastline to the west. He found the merchant Bjarni, now an old man, and bought his ship, the very same vessel that had been kissed by the shores of an unknown continent. He was going to finish what Bjarni had started. He was going to find that land. He approached his father. Despite their differences, Leif knew he needed Erik's blessing. He told him this would be his greatest achievement, a new world to conquer, a final grand chapter in his saga. The old man was tempted. The fire of ambition still burned in his eyes. He agreed. He saw a chance to expand his world, to add another kingdom to his name. But fate, or perhaps the old gods, had other plans. As Erik the Red rode his horse down to the docks to board the ship, the animal, he saw it as a terrible omen. "It is not my destiny to discover more lands than this one we now live in," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We will sail no further together." The journey would belong to Leif alone. His father's shadow was finally lifting. This would be his saga. Not Erik's. Leif gathered a crew of 35 men. They were a mix of seasoned sailors. They loaded the Nar, a sturdy Viking cargo ship, with provisions, tools, and livestock. They were not just going to see this new land, they were preparing to stay. As they pushed off from the shores of Greenland, a profound silence fell over the crew. They were sailing west into the sea of gaping nothingness, a place from which many sailors never returned. Their only guide was Bjarni's vague second. They navigated by the sun, the stars, the flight of seabirds, and the feel of the ocean swell. It was an act of supreme skill and almost insane courage. For days they saw nothing but an endless expanse of grey water and grey sky. The cold was a physical thing, a beast that gnawed at their bones. Doubt began to creep into the hearts of the men. Was Bjarni's story? And then, after what felt like an eternity, the lookout screamed land. But it wasn't the green forested land of Bjarni's tale. What they saw was a desolate coastline of flat, barren rock covered by massive glaciers in the distance. There was no life, no color, just stone and ice. Leif decided to go ashore. As his feet crunched on the rocky beach, he looked upon the bleak landscape. "We will give this today. We know it as Baffin Island." They did not linger. This was not the place they sought. They pushed back out to sea, sailing south, the grim, icy coast of Helluland shadowing their journey. Days later they sighted land again. This time it matched Bjarni's description, a flat, wooded coastline with long, white sand beaches. Leif led another party ashore. The air was thick with the scent. This land was rich. Leif named it Markland, the land of forests. It was a paradise of timber, a resource more valuable than gold to the settlers of Greenland. We now know this was the coast of Labrador. They had found a land of plenty, a place that could sustain them. But Leif felt a pull, a sense of destiny that told him this was still not their final stop. There was something more further south. He had a feeling, They replenished their supplies, took on fresh water, and once again set their course to the south. For 2 more days they sailed with a strong northeast wind at their backs. Then the lookout's cry was different. Not just land, but a specific island, lying to the north of a larger landmass. They sailed into the channel between the island and a green promontory. The morning dew on the grass shimmered. The sense of arrival was overwhelming. They had done it. They had crossed the abyss and found a world of impossible beauty. They sailed up a river that flowed from a lake and dropped anchor. The water was teeming with life. Salmon larger than any they had ever caught filled the river. The air was mild, the land lush and fertile. There was no need to even gather fodder for their cattle during the winter. The days and nights were more equal in length than in Greenland, a sign they were much, much further south. This was it. This was the place Leif Erikson, son of an outlaw, had stepped into a new world. He made a decision. They would stay for the winter. They weren't explorers anymore, they were settlers. They hauled their ship ashore and built shelters, a great hall for the crew, smaller huts for storage. They called it Leif's Bee Fair. Leif's booths, as his men set about the work of building their new home, Leif divided them into 2 parties. Each day, one group would stand guard and maintain the camp, while the other would explore the surrounding land. He gave them a strict order. They must stay together and return before nightfall. He knew the dangers of a new, wild place. The greatest danger is not what you can see, but what you can't. They found timber, game, and endless pastures. It was a utopia compared to the frozen rock they had left behind. One evening, one of the exploration parties returned a man short. A man named Turka was missing. This was a serious blow. Turka wasn't just a crewman. He was a German, a southerner who had been a foster, father to Leif in his childhood. He was family. Leif was furious at his men for their carelessness. He took a party of 12 men and went back into the darkening woods to search for him. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming in the daylight, now felt menacing. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a threat. After a frantic search, they found him. Turka wasn't hurt. He was laughing, babbling excitedly in German, his eyes wide. At first, they thought he had gone mad. For the Norsemen, who came from lands too cold for viticulture, this was a miracle. It was a sign of a warm, rich climate. It was proof that this land was blessed. Leif now had a name for his discovery, a name that would echo through the sagas for 1,000 years. He called it Vinland, the land of wine now. A quick pause. If you are finding this forgotten chapter of history as fascinating as it tells the algorithm that you want more stories that challenge the official narrative, and it helps us continue to bring these incredible tales to light. Your support makes all the difference. Now, back to Vinland. They spent the winter in a state of wonder. They felled trees, cured grapes, and prepared a full cargo of timber for the return journey. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. When spring came, they loaded their ship, the Nar heavy with timber and bundles of dried grapes, and set sail for Greenland. The return journey was a triumph. Leif became a hero. He was no longer just the son of Eric the Red. He was Leif the Lucky. He had sailed into the void and returned with proof of a new world. He had also earned a small fortune from the cargo, further cementing his status. But the story of Vinland was far from over. It had just begun. The tales of this warm, fertile land spread like wildfire across the small, isolated communities of Greenland. It was a beacon of hope. Leif, now the chieftain after his father Eric's death, had other responsibilities and never returned to Vinland. But his siblings were not content to let his glory stand alone. He borrowed Leif's ship and, with a crew of 30 men, set sail for Leifsby Fear. They found the settlement just as Leif had left it and spent their first winter there, surviving on the abundant fish. The dream was still alive in the spring. Thorvald took a small party and began exploring the coastline. They travelled west, then north. They saw a beautiful wooded country, but they saw something else too. On a sandy beach they found they were not alone. They returned to Leifsby Fair for another winter. The next summer, Thorvald decided to explore to the east and north. They were hit by a violent storm that shattered their keel on the shore of a headland. They spent weeks repairing the ship, a painstaking process in a land so far from home. After the repairs were complete, Thorvald planted the old splintered keel in the sand and named the place. They saw a headland covered in forest. It looked so peaceful. They dropped anchor and went ashore, and there, under the trees, they found them 3 skin, covered boats, and under each 3 men, 9 in total. The people the Norse would come to call Skarplingar for the first time, Europeans and the indigenous people of North America stood face to face. What happened next would set the tone for centuries of conflict to come. The Vikings, outnumbered but technologically superior with their iron weapons, attacked. They killed 8 of the men. 1 escaped in his canoe. It was an act of brutal, preemptive violence, a fatal miscalculation. The Vikings returned to their headland, expecting they had neutralized the threat. But as they rested, a great swarm of skin boats came pouring out of a nearby fjord. The man who escaped had brought. Thorvald tried to rally his men, telling them to use their shields and fight from the ship. The Skarplingar fought fiercely, and then, as quickly as they appeared, they vanished back into the landscape. The battle was over, but it was not without a cost. Thorvald Erikson, son of Eric the Red, had been hit. An arrow had slipped under his arm beneath his shield. He knew the wound was fatal. An arrow flew between the edge of the ship and the shield into my armpit. Here is the arrow, and this wound will cause my death. I advise you now to prepare for your departure as quickly as possible, but you shall carry me to that headland which I thought was the most pleasant of all. It may be that a truth was in my mouth when I said that I would dwell there for a time. You shall bury me there and place crosses at my head and feet, and call it Crossanes forever. And so the first European to be buried in American soil died because of an act of violence he himself had initiated. His crew returned to Leif's Erikson, their hearts heavy. The dream of Vinland was beginning to sour. They spent a third winter there, gathering grapes and timber, but the joy was gone. The land was no longer a paradise. It was hostile. It was watching them. But the lure of the new world was too strong. Leif's other brother, Thorstein, decided he must go to Vinland to retrieve Thorvald's body. He set sail with his wife, Gudrid, a woman of remarkable strength and foresight, who would become a central figure in the Vinland story. But this voyage was cursed from the start. They were battered by storms all summer, blown off. They ended up back on the coast of Greenland, far from their home settlement, as winter set in disease, swept through their camp, and Thorstein Erikson died. The dream of Vinland had now claimed two of Erik the Red's sons. It seemed the Erikson family was destined for failure in this new land, but then came a new attempt. The most ambitious of them all, a wealthy Icelandic merchant, he was a man of great substance and skill. He heard the stories of Vinland and saw not just adventure, but an opportunity. He decided to lead a full-scale colonization effort. This was no mere exploration. He gathered 3 ships and 160 people, including women. Leif's sister-in-law, the now widowed Gudrid, married Karlsefni and joined the expedition. They brought livestock, tools, and they sailed to Leif's Erikson and settled in for a time. It seemed the dream was renewed. The first winter was hard, but they survived in the summer. Gudrid gave birth to a son, Snorri Thorfinnsson, the first European child born in the Americas. That summer, the score Fillingar returned, but this time it was different. A great crowd of them emerged from the woods, not with Karlsefni forbade his men from trading their iron weapons, a wise decision. Instead, they traded red cloth and milk. The Skar Fillingar were fascinated by these things. A peaceful, prosperous trade was established. It seemed that coexistence was possible. The two worlds met, not in violence, but in commerce. But the peace was fragile, a thin sheet of ice. One day, a bull belonging to the Norsemen broke loose from its pen and charged, bellowing towards the Skar Fillingar. They were terrified. They had never seen such an animal. They fled to their canoes and paddled away. The trade was broken. The peace was shattered. For 3 weeks there was silence. Then they returned, but this time they came for war. Karlsefni and the Skar Fillingar used a terrifying weapon, a large dark sphere hoisted on a pole which they launched from a kind of catapult. It made a horrific noise as it flew through the air and crashed among the Norsemen, causing panic. The Vikings, brave warriors though they were overwhelmed. They began to retreat. Their dream of a colony was collapsing into a bloody rout. It was at this moment of utter despair that one of the most ferocious figures in the sagas stepped forward. Her name was Freydis Erikson. She was the illegitimate daughter of Erik the Red, and she possessed all of his fire and none of his restraint. She was pregnant, but that did not stop her. As the Norsemen fled, she screamed at them. "Why do you run from such wretches, you worthless? If I had a weapon, I am sure I would fight better than any of you." She saw a dead Norseman on the ground, his sword lying beside him. She snatched it up. The Skar Fillingar advanced on her. Without hesitation, Freydis pulled one of her breasts from her tunic and slapped it with the flat of the sword, letting out a terrifying war cry. The sight of this wild, pregnant woman, seemingly mad with battle rage, they halted, then retreated. Freydis, a single woman, had saved the colony, but the victory was hollow. Karlsefni knew they could never live in peace. The threat of attack was constant. The dream was dead. After 3 years in Vinland, they packed up their belongings, abandoned the settlement, and sailed back to Greenland. Snorri, the first American-born European, would grow up in Isla chapter of Freydis Erikson. She was consumed by a desire for the wealth and fame that Vinland could bring. She organized one last expedition with 2 brothers from Iceland, Helgi and Finnbogi. They agreed to go in partnership, each taking 1 ship and 30 fighting men. But Freydis was treacherous. She secretly packed more men onto her own ship. When they arrived, Freydis immediately declared that since her brother Leif had built the houses, they belonged to her. She forced the 2 brothers and their men to build their own settlement. Tensions simmered all winter. Freydis then hatched a wicked plan one morning. She went to Finnbogi's hut, barefoot, wearing only a cloak. She told him she wanted to trade ships, that his was larger and she wanted to leave Vinland. He agreed. She had torn at her clothes and face. She told him that the brothers had beaten her and demanded that he avenge her honor. Her husband, reluctant but goaded into action, took his men and went to the other camp while they were sleeping. They seized and bound all the men. Freydis then ordered that every single one of them be killed. Her husband and his men carried out the slaughter, but they refused to kill the 5 women in. "Hand me an axe," she sneered, and with her own hands she murdered the 5 women in cold blood. She returned to her camp and swore her men to secrecy, promising death to anyone who spoke of the massacre. This brutal, horrific act was the final nail in the coffin of the Viking dream in America. The land was not just hostile from the outside. The Norsemen had brought their own darkness with them. Freydis returned to Greenland. Her ship, the story of what she did eventually came out, but she was Leif's sister. And while she was scorned, she was never truly punished. And with that, the saga of Vinland ends. The voyages stopped. The route was forgotten. A continent was lost. For nearly 1,000 years, this entire epic was dismissed as fantasy. The Vinland sagas were just stories, Viking myths of a land of wine. The idea of Vikings in America was the stuff of fiction. But then, in the 1960s, everything changed. A Norwegian explorer named Helgingstad and his archaeologist wife, Anne Stein, were obsessed with the sagas. They believed the stories were not myths but history. They studied the descriptions of the coastlines, the sailing directions, the landmarks. They were convinced Vinland was real, and they asked local fishermen if they had ever seen any old ruins. Finally, a man in the small fishing village of Lelandsoaks Meadows told them about some old mounds, which he had always thought were an old Indian camp. The Ingstads went to investigate. They started to dig. What they found would rewrite the history of the world. They unearthed the remains of a Norse settlement, the foundations of 8 turf-walled buildings. They found a smithy with a stone anvil and hundreds of iron rivets from a Viking ship. They found a spindle, wall and a bone needle, proof that women had been there, weaving cloth. It was Leifsby Fair. It was Thorfinn Karlsefni's colony. It was real. Carbon dating confirmed the site was from around the year 1000 AD. Exactly the time of Leif Erikson. Suddenly the sagas weren't just the land of flat stones, the land of forests, the land of wine. It was all there in the geography of North America. Helluland was Baffin Island. Markland was Labrador. And Vinland was Newfoundland, and the lands around the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a region where wild grapes do, in fact, grow. The first European child born in America wasn't Virginia Dare in the 16th century. The first battle between Europeans and Native Americans wasn't fought by conquistadors, but by Viking explorers. Why was it all forgotten? Why did this incredible achievement fade into myth? The answer is complex. The Viking settlement in Greenland, the launching point for the Vinland voyages, was itself doomed. A cooling climate, the so-called Little Ice Age, made farming and survival there increasingly difficult. With its collapse, the lifeline to Vinland was severed. The route, passed down by memory, was lost. Unlike Columbus, the Vikings were not backed by the power of a nation-state. Theirs was a private enterprise, a family affair. There was no king to fund further voyages, no empire to claim the new territory. And crucially, they lacked the 2 things that made Columbus's. The Vikings' iron weapons gave them an edge, but they were vastly outnumbered by the native population who knew the land and were fighting for their homes. The Vikings could win a battle, but they couldn't win the war. They came, they saw, but they did not conquer, and so their foothold in the new world crumbled. Their story became a memory, then a legend, then a forgotten whisper. But the fact remains. Leif, the Norsemen who built those turf huts at Leland's Orks Meadows, were the first. Their story is a testament to the incredible skill, courage, and ambition of the Viking people. They were not just raiders and pirates. They were the greatest explorers of their age, pushing the boundaries of the known world further than anyone had ever dared. The story of Vinland reminds us that history is not a simple, linear path. It is a messy, complicated web of forgotten voyages, lost colonies, and stories that lie buried, waiting to be rediscovered. The map of our past is always being redrawn. The truth is often hidden, not in the grand histories written by kings and conquerors, but in the epic poems and fireside tales of those who sailed into the great unknown and dared to touch a new world, if only for a fleeting moment. If you enjoyed this journey into the lost history of Vinland, please subscribe and give it a like to support the channel. It helps more than you know. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.